What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations 2020 Best Podcast News Award winner, 2018 Innovation Award winner, given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. And officially now, I am the co-host and co-producer of the only online show in the world for dads and fathers that is sponsored by Dove Men Plus Care. It's also co-sponsored by Dad Central, Canada's national fatherhood organization. So it launched last Friday, and we've got a lot of great conversations with fathers to come. And if you were watching, we're live today on June 19th. Happy Father's Day. Happy Juneteenth. We'll be getting that during the conversation today. But yesterday on a CTV News Channel, I was interviewed about dads and fatherhood and Dad Central, et cetera, et cetera. So if you make time or if you have time, you can go check it out. But I'll be posting the link somewhere in cyberspace. As always, I like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. It's Black Canada Talking, Sunday afternoon. So let's bring up our two friends, Elle Jones.
Hi.
And Cesar Ndema-Moussa. What's going on?
I'm good, everyone. Happy Father's Day to everyone, and always thank you for hosting us, Dr. Vibe.
The pleasure is mine. So it's a little bit of a different look. Our producer, I think, is taking his Father's Day today.
Yeah.
So I'm stepping up and filling in his capable producer hands, and I'm going to do the best I can. So everything been good since we last chatted with each other? One good?
Yeah, just normal.
Just normal, just hanging out. Well, actually,
I know I'm like Sunday casual today. I was just up with Dr. Lynn Jones and Truro. I literally just got back.
Just out with Dr. Lynn Jones. Just out. Okay, so I'm actually going to see if I can do something. Well, it's funny because Elle Jones, I thought I could meet Elle Jones before most people I know meet Elle Jones. Yesterday, she had the opportunity. She met an associate of mine, Nicole Waldron, and you really laid it down at this co-op housing conference.
Yeah, the Canadian Housing Federation. So I was doing some poems, and I wrote a poem for it. So yeah,
nice, very, very nice. Now, Cesar, I thought you and I would meet before. There's a lady you always mention I should have on this platform all the time. What's her name?
Katia Peters, CEO of Roots and Culture Canada.
Yes. Who's that?
I saw.
You saw, she told you.
I saw the photo. Toronto Black Entrepreneurs Summit.
Yeah, Federal Black Entrepreneurs Summit. And I don't know, I just sat beside her and just, Katia Peters. I go, what? Where's Cesar? I go, where's Cesar at? But and you know what, Cesar? Everything you said about her is right and more.
I forgot you're an entrepreneur. You need to do a survey for me. Not survey. You have to answer some. Can you answer some? I shouldn't ask you this live on air, but whatever. Can you answer some interview questions for guys in prison?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to send you the interview questions.
Yeah, anything I can serve. No
problem.
I
was like, I don't know any business people.
But and you know what? If you want, I can introduce you to a whole.
Well, they have to interview people about entrepreneurship and business stuff, and
I've got a long list, so we can chat offline. And
perfect.
Black male and black women, both sides. I got a long list for you, so no worries.
Awesome.
Like people like Roger Dundas of buyblacks.com.
That's right. I forgot I know all those people.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what to do because I don't know anyone in business, and I have to connect them to business people so they can ask questions because they have to do their own business plan and stuff. So yeah.
Anything to help out. Help out. You know that. Well, so since we do have a life outside of this show, but let's get back to the show.
Sorry,
right?
Yeah. I'm like, we're on air.
We got to it. Well, I think the big story, probably one of the big stories in Black Canada this week, was the Toronto police apologizing to Black Canadians based on a report that shows showing that Blacks and Indigenous people are over police. Really, they needed a report on that? What do we have to say about this story?
Yeah, well, I'll start, I guess. So the first thing is that this is internal data. So Scott Wortley, who also did the Street Check report in Halifax in 2019, and I believe the Toronto report on carding 7 years, like 2012 maybe. He had done a report in 2020 on use of force that laid out a lot of this. So that was an external report. But this is internal numbers, which they did not collect out of the goodness of their heart. They were ordered to collect these numbers, so they're forced to keep and then release this race-based data. And of course, clearly the numbers, as they knew, were going to be so bad that before they released the report, they announced they were going to basically preemptively apologize. So this isn't something that the Black community asked for. This is like the police were forced to keep this data, particularly strip search data. This was after a court decision that really constrained the use of strip searches because they've been just really overusing them. There's been long reports of Black women being strip searched in public that go way back for decades. Robin talks about in her book, Beverly Bain, who spoke at the press conference, has been documenting this. This is well documented. So just to say that the difference between this and other reports is it's based on internal police data. That is interesting only because the right-wing talking point has become that the data isn't adjusted. So they're like, oh, but like, what if Black people commit more crimes? And like, that's not how data works. Like before you release the data, you do all the variables. And as every report has shown, including Scott Wortley's report, sorry, I'm wearing headphones and they're kind of falling out, including Scott Wortley's report, like once they adjust for everything, like weapons, criminal records, crime, all of that. And the only variable is race. And that is also true of the police data. So just to say that the right wing have very quickly tried to start this talking point that, well, what if you come from a high crime neighborhood? Like, what if Black people committing more crimes? And that is already adjusted from the data, just to be really clear about that. I think that's important. Also, the Sun misquoted Scott Wortley's report in making this argument. This reporter from the Sun who was at the press conference, who kept trying to ask the police, well, don't Black people commit more crimes? And even the police were like, yeah, no, like that's not what we're doing here. He goes and writes an article where he misquotes Wortley's use of force report to make it look like Wortley says that it's possible that Black people commit crimes. And that's not true. I literally read that report a month ago, and he very clearly shows it by every metric. So, for example, armed white people are less likely to be shot by the police than unarmed white people, for one example. Black people are 230 more times likely to be shot by the police, like when they don't have a weapon and they're unarmed. Like, you know, these are massive statistics. Strip searches, Black people are, I think, 1.6 or something. And don't trust me on these stats, times more likely to be strip searched. So it's basically 1.5 more times. Everything, like from tasers to, you know, use of force during arrests to, like, on every metric, Black people are being shown to experience more use of force, which should surprise none of us. So I'm giving a lot of background just to say that nobody asked for this apology. The police clearly knew that the numbers are bad. So this is why they came out and tried to preempt it with an apology, which isn't really how apologies work. Nobody asked for an apology. People have asked them to stop racially profiling us, to stop, you know, getting funding for weapons. We've asked cities to stop giving them a budget and to defund them. We've asked them to, you know, to stay out of our neighborhoods, to stop delivering warrants with tanks, to stop showing up at mental health calls. I mean, we've been making these demands. We didn't ask them to apologize. We've asked them to stop brutalizing and murdering us, which they refused to do. They also, interestingly enough and importantly, they said that despite this data, they're not going to use it to discipline individual officers. So even though they know they have officers committing use of force, they're not going to actually look at that and see who's committing these incidents and discipline them, fire them, even send them for training. They're not using it for individual tracking at all. And we know that officers that end up, particularly in fatal shootings, usually and often have previous incidents. So, and we don't know the names of those officers. So we know that, you know, some people who are out here killing Black people usually have use of force incidents before that, often multiple. They don't get pulled off the job. They don't get suspended. They don't lose their pay. They get defended by the police unions, and we don't even know their names. So you don't even know who these people are. And this report is continuing this by refusing to use this as any kind of early warning system to say, okay, this person roughed someone up in arrest. We should intervene before they kill somebody. So they're not using it for any of that. So the last thing I'll say before we move to Cesar is that I've made the point, and others have as well, I don't think this is original thinking, that systemic racism has now become the new bad apples, in that now they'll cite systemic racism, but in a way that suggests that systemic racism exists completely separate from the people in the system. So a leaked email that they had before the report came out, when they wrote to the rank and file, they were like, oh, you're going to, be hearing a lot of bad stuff in the next couple of days, but rest assured, it's not you. This is systemic racism. It's not about individual officers. I'm like, so how does systemic racism exist without any racists? Some of these officers are racist. So they're basically going, oh, this thing exists, but nobody's responsible for it. That is not how systemic racism works, right? So this has become the new dodge. As Beverly Bain said, you gave that apology for your rank and file. It's not for us. You're trying to preempt our criticism because you're worried about how the rank and file will protest and complain when they're held to account. So I've said enough there. I guess we'll go to Cesar and then we can come back to me. So go ahead, Cesar.
Well, honestly, I think you said it right because truthfully, first of all, I understand those of our sisters and brothers in the Black community of Toronto will reject that apology because that apology does not bring anyone Black who has been killed. At the same time, this is, I believe, an interim chief, James Raymer. Where are all the other previous police chiefs? And by previous police chiefs, I don't want any focus on former police chief Saunders, aka the only Black police chief that's been in Toronto, because truthfully, yes, the problem is systemic. But as Sister L just said, for it to be systemic, that means there's a lot of racists in the place. And there has to be the acknowledgement that it's not just a matter of saying systemic racism, it's also to recognize that we do have people who are racist in our organization, and the mindset lead to actions that are painful and deadly to those of the Black community, in brackets, and also indigenous and other non-whites. So I think more concrete actions should have followed right away. You know, it's kind of like for indigenous people. We can talk truth and reconciliation and apology, but at the end of the day, where's the money? Where's the reparations? Who's going to jail? Who's going to jail? Who's reviewing the cases and who is basically going to address the justice system in order to free some, too many, Black people who are there innocently? While we have murderer cops, racist cops, abuser cops who are enjoying freedom, who are enjoying a paycheck, who are enjoying their vacations, all by taxpayers' dollars. These are part of the problem. So, and this is part of the reason why it's very hard for many to accept the apology. Yes, an apology matters. It's very often the first step to being able to create any type of repair, if not a bridge. But you can't just think people are going to accept your apology after so much hurt, aka decades of pain and hurt in terms of an institution that truthfully represents as well white supremacy, that reinforces oppression. So it has to be that Toronto police has to come stronger in terms of measures that are to be addressed. And all these police forces apologizing and recognizing systemic racism, it means very little if they don't review files and if there are no cops who become not just dismissed from the functions, fired if you want, but fired without the possibility of being hired elsewhere, but they have to be jailed. It's too easy from a police perspective, like in the US, you get fired from one place, the county next door or the city next door, they hire you. It's too easy. So it grows a distrust towards police as an institution. And of course, it confirms for too many Black people the fact that why should you want your son to join the police? Why should you want your daughter to join the police? Even as a civilian, you become seen as a traitor in the community itself, because we know very well that having a Black cop does not mean the community is any safer when ultimately the boss is still white, when ultimately the system, the institution is still very much a representation of white supremacy.
Elle, one of the things that I was concerned about, why were the police, or how did the police allowed to investigate themselves?
Oh, no, because they've been ordered to keep that data, right? So this is a court order. So it's usually external people like Wortley doing a review. And so this was a court order. So again, this isn't something they did from the goodness of their hearts. They were ordered to keep this data and to track use of force. And then, of course, they have to sort of report it. And then obviously these numbers. So, I mean, this is what's interesting about it is that normally, of course, when these kind of reports come out, people are labeled as cop haters. because it's usually like, when we do the defunding report or when somebody else does street checks, there's usually this idea that, these external people are causing harm to the police, but this is their own numbers. And that's why, like, the disputing of the data is interesting to me, because I'm like, you think if the cops could weasel out of this data, they wouldn't have already? Like, it's their data. Like, if they could find any way to show that it's actually just high crime neighborhoods, or we have tons of warrants, or we commit more crimes, they would have done that. Like, it's there. And that's why, in that sense, the data is indisputable. This isn't some lefty academic coming in and getting the data. This is internal data. So they were forced to do this as part of, they talk about it in the beginning of the report. I skipped over that bit, honestly, when I was reading it. But like, beginning of the report has a bunch of like information about what their data collection policy is, why they're doing it. But yeah, don't be fooled. This isn't something they chose to do. They had to do this. And they're mandated to tell us about it as well. And that's why we're finding out about these numbers. Historically, obviously, it's quite hard to get a lot of this kind of information out of the police, right? You often have to FOIPOP them for it. Like, it's hard to get this data. So the fact that it's their own data and that their own data shows that the only explaining variable is race, that part is important, because like I said, the right wing is trying to suggest that it's actually like that we commit more crimes or we're more violent, or, that it's because we have criminal records, and it's not, because that data is controlled to that.
Cesar, anything you want to add? And what did you find it concerning or problematic that the police had a chance to investigate themselves and said, we're sorry?
Well, it's always a problem, because if you have an institution that polices itself, sure, you can get an apology, but it's really a matter of mindset. Who can truly be objective if they are the jury, the executioner, and basically they have the entire power to look at themselves and to apply any type of sanction? So if I give another example, look at how we're talking about the state of the Canadian Army in regard to sexual abuse. As long as the Army or the police or any other institution is the one who basically investigates itself, we will never be able to know the full truth, nor we will be able to really believe the truth that comes out of it. 230% more is a high number, sure. But then, is it really 230% when it's the police that investigated itself? There's a matter of, if we live in a democracy, where is the civilian body that oversees the police? And please, nobody says the SIU, because we know how more often than not, the SIU, aka Special Investigation Unit, tends to find the police to be not at fault. More often than not, the vast majority of the time, the SIU does not blame the police. It's a hard case. It's a hard case mainly because most of the people in the SIU are former police themselves. They're former police themselves. So, we talk about democracy, but these are forms of corruption in the system in the same way. And I'm going to stretch on purpose. When we talk about the gun debate in the United States, and the NRA is a lobby paying politicians, aka legalized corruption. That's what it is. So you don't really see change over there when we talk about the gun debate. And here you don't really see change when we talk about police reform, police brutality, etc. Because, the police is a very conservative institution, just like the Army. They don't like to have people from outside, civilians, minorities, the people like Al Jones, who will write that report on the police, the people like me, who will speak up, but then also give trainings on this matter. Much respect, as we're talking about this, much respect to Cornwall Police Service, whom I've trained, from senior leadership to new hires in the staff. But again, an exception that confirms the rule. How many of these police forces want to have someone who will be straightforward, speak truthfully, challenge them to go above and beyond, make them see from different police services, if you want, police forces, to see what the impact of the police is upon the community, especially those of minority identities. It's a matter of trust beyond the uniform, beyond speaking of black and white. It's a matter of trust. When you don't trust the institution, you cannot trust the apology.
Elle, what would you, and I know you've mentioned it in other forms before, but as we sit here on June 19th, 2022, what do you want? What would be your declaration when it comes to policing of blacks? What do you want, and what would be your intent? What would you want?
So get him gone. No, I mean, but the path. This is, I mean, this is why we talk about defunding, right? Which some people have tried to make into some like complex or controversial thing, and it's quite literally like, if you give them more money, they use it, and when they have more money, they buy weapons, and when they have weapons, they use them. So, for example, everybody said they needed armored vehicles after the Ottawa terrorist shooter thing, and then Justin Bork in Moncton. And they were like, oh, we need armored vehicles. Well, what are they using armored vehicles for? They didn't use it in Port-au-Peak for the mass shooter. They're using it to deliver warrants in the black community. So we know when we give them the instruments of force, they use them. When they have budgets, they use them. And the budgets don't go to whatever people like to imagine policing is, like more cops walking the beat. It goes into salaries. It goes into like their overtime. We don't need police to be doing traffic when we can do traffic enforcement through cameras, like red light cameras. We can do civilian-based traffic enforcement. We don't need to be paying cops all that money on a weekend to stand at a parade when like anybody can put on a vest and as a trained traffic person can do it. We obviously don't need the police involved in mental health calls, which they're not trained for. We don't need police for bylaws. We don't need them policing unhoused people, because we shouldn't be policing unhoused people, period. We don't need to be criminalizing drugs. So we could drop all of that. So, even before we get to like abolishing the police, if we just reduce the scope of tasks that the police are doing, this would give them much less ability to do these kind of things to us. Like, why are we surprised when, the biggest budget item in every single city, the biggest municipal budget is always policing, which is more than libraries, recreation, transportation, all of that stuff combined. So if that's where 40% or whatever it is in your city of your municipal budget goes to, then you use them. And then don't be surprised that they use on Black and Indigenous communities. So the way to stop this isn't through apologies or training or more Black officers. It's to reduce the money that the police are given, reduce the scope of police activity, pull police back at the very least from things they have no business being involved in, return the money into communities so that we can productively use it in communities to do prevention, such as youth employment programs, education, diversion, intervention in domestic violence or like family violence at early stages. All of those things actually, therapy, drug treatment, all those things actually deal with the issues. So we've been very clear about this, and like defunding is the sort of contemporary term. This is not a new idea. The Panthers in their 10-point plan talked about this. We know that in any political movement, what happened in apartheid in South Africa, we're like, stop funding apartheid. That's defund. If you want to stop an oppressive group, then you stop giving them money. And if you keep giving them money, they keep oppressing people. And the same thing holds to the police. It's the same reason why we boycotted South Africa, the same reason why, white people will like boycott Russia, but they can't understand why we shouldn't give money to the police. So, I think it's very clear.
Okay. So, Zara, anything you want to add? What would you like to see the best outcome when it comes to policing Blacks?
First of all, I have to applaud Sister L, because she gave a perfect example in terms of, you get white people supporting Ukraine and understanding that we have to cut funds to Russia in terms of aggressing Ukraine, but they can't understand the Russian aggression in terms of police brutality, and then suddenly they oppose either defunding the police or they oppose reforming the police. Because why? Because they feel more protected by the police, which is not a reality for Black people. So really, it's a matter of perspectives, and as such, what must happen, as I say again, it's not enough to talk about training. It's not enough to talk about anti-oppression or basically unconscious bias and EDI training. Yes, I do all of those, but also address policies and procedures. I also address targeted diversity hiring, and I also address proper investigation that lead to firings. Some people have to be fired. Some people need to be taken to court. We have too many Black and other non-white people who are innocent in jail, while we have too many white and other racists who are free, working, and yet their mindset lead to decisions that impact families and individuals over generations.
Very true. Anyone want to add before we move on to our next conversation?
No, but we have a question in the chat.
I know
Thoughts
we
on
do.
the conservative leadership race?
We'll save that till the end.
Okay.
Because we have a flow that we want to make sure we get through. So next up, going to talk about anti-Black racism by Chinese and Asians. Now, Cesar, you wanted to bring that up. Plus, we're going to share an article on the screen. So lead the topic, please.
Yes. So there's been an uproar that has come lately. I think BBC released either an article this week, but it was more regarding a situation that happened 2 years ago, if I'm correct. And this happened in the Zambia. In Zambia or Tanzania, sorry, Tanzania, if I'm correct. And it's basically about basically the production of racist videos by Chinese foreigners in Eastern Africa that are sold to China, kind of in something of a form of entertainment that can seem very bizarre, very odd. So how can I put it? It's going to seem really weird because if you want to understand where it comes from, so yes, we can be appalled, we can be disgusted. We have to be honest first and foremost. Poverty, quite unfortunately, tends to lead to exploitation, notably due to ignorance. You basically end up having these Black families, fathers and mothers, thinking the children are taking part in an innocent video where a Chinese person makes them say some Chinese words, telling them it means one thing when it means something else. The something else usually being, I'm Black, or I am N-word, I'm dirty, I'm stupid, these type of things. And this goes to China, where many people like it. When I say many people, let us not forget there are people who get appalled. Also, there are Chinese people who find it offensive. But we have to understand where this comes from. And when I say we have to understand where this comes from, first and foremost, as I always teach in my forums and conferences, we talk about white supremacy a lot. But we live in a world where there are other forms of white supremacy. There are other forms of supremacy and supremacy that tend to kill mainly two groups of people, indigenous people and Black people on the four corners of the world. And as such, what you end up having here, what many people will call Chinese supremacy, is not exactly Chinese supremacy. To be specific, it's Han supremacy, H-A-N, the dominant ethnicity in China, comprising 92 to 95% of the Chinese population. Understand, with 1.5 billion of people, 1% is a lot of people. So what you end up having with the Han supremacy, historically speaking, first, you have to understand that China, for centuries, had what is called a tributary system, aka other nations of Southeast Asia basically paid tribute to the Chinese emperor in order to do commerce with China. This basically put Chinese in terms of supremacy in the whole area. One of the things that changed was Westerners' desire to impose commerce on their own favorable terms led to what is called the Century of Humiliation. The Century of Humiliation, which basically was notably created the loss of Hong Kong, because from the mid-19th century, and when you basically had, I forget the name in Chinese, but you basically had the biggest civil war that killed anywhere from 20 to 30 millions in terms of lowest estimates, up to 50, 60 million Chinese due to basically a revolt that began notably spurred by white Christian missionaries and leading notably to Japan and the Westerners trying to take parts of China. This is also where you get the Opium War, etc., etc. For what concerns us specifically as Black people, it is the discovery in the 1920s of fossils of ancient humans, aka the Peking men. First of all, it's not in Peking, it's a little distance off, But what it basically led to, what was purely anthropological, paleontological and anthropological find, basically a scientific find, became a tool of Chinese nationalism propaganda. Chinese nationalist propaganda because of the study of an evolutionary scientist, a Jewish German, Franz Weidenreich, who basically created the theory that humans evolved from multiple regions to become the modern day humans that we are today. The polycentric or multi-regional theory became debunked as proven by the out of Africa theory that all humans on the four corners of the world are descendants of Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us, that replaced Homo erectus. Peking man is an evolution of Homo erectus, but got replaced by Homo sapiens sapiens, aka modern day humans who came out of Africa between 150,000 to 65,000 years ago and came from Southeast Asia all the way to China. This became impossible to accept by the Chinese communist leadership and as such in the history books, but also forcing the scientific community to propagate the notion of Peking men in terms of saying the Chinese people are different, particular, and as such superior. Superior, why? Notably because of the finding of fires in the cave where they found Peking men. The name of the cave was Zukudian. One of the things that happened is basically that by this notion, Chinese people, many, the vast majority, got subjugated to educational indoctrination by the regime in order to think of themselves not only as different from the rest of humanity, but also as superior to Africans. This you can notably see by the fact of, I think it was in 2018, they notably had the Spring Festival TV show where you basically have a Chinese actor doing blackface and stereotyping some African behaviors and becoming a mockery. A few years ago, I believe in 2017, there was a museum in China that depicted Africans next to images of animals with similar facial expressions. The latest example, this video of that the BBC published in terms of these cards, where you basically have racist Chinese exploiting the poverty and innocence slash ignorance of Africans to enrich themselves. But you also have the relation, what that's called China Africa, Chine Afrique in French, where you basically have a power relations through the Silk and Belt Road Initiative, where China has so much economic power over African nations, but it's not that those African nations are necessarily poor. The leaders are corrupt, and as such, the population does not benefit from it. Even as you have in China the largest African population in Asia, in the city and proximity of Guangzhou, what you end up having is that this notion of Chinese superiority is taught in the school and part of the culture. And this, even when, and that's the last one I will make, you have what's called the Human Genome Project that started in 1990 to 2003, where you had teams of international scientists coming together, just like the space station, but coming together to work at a molecular level in terms of the DNA to find the roots of humanity. And even the Chinese team, led by Professor Jin Li of Fudan University, close to Shanghai, even that team, Professor Jin Li, will admit it. At first, his education came from Chinese people being descendant of Peking men and being different from the rest of humanity. But even Professor Jin Li came to the conclusion and admitted it openly. All Chinese people are descendant of Africa, like the rest of humanity. And this is easily proven by the fact that you can have interracial babies, notably half black, half Chinese babies that are born. And yet, still to this day, Chinese, and notably Chinese scientists, will speak the truth in terms of the out of Africa theory are basically shunned. They are basically silenced, notably on the internet, Chinese internet, Weibo. But it's this type of mindset that has created this type of particular racism that we see upon Black people. And for us, we can also see that with the coronavirus, where Africans, but not just Africans, even Black Americans were subjected to racism in Chinese cities, even if they had valid passport visa and even if they didn't have COVID. We have to denounce these situations because this type of mindset is very dangerous. When I say very dangerous, it was just last week. Last week, I believe June 14th, if I'm correct. Back in 1992, there was the murder of Latasha Harlins, a young African American teenager who got shot in the head by a Korean gross corner store owner, convinced that she stole, but she didn't. Tupac Shakur notably dedicated the song "Keep Your Head Up" to her. At the same time, you see, for example, in Japan, you have this notion called the heifu, where basically ridicule is made to those who are half Black, half Japanese, those who are mixed, but especially those who are half Black, half Japanese, because they are seen as inferior. So these are consequences of white supremacy, but especially of people viewing negatively Blackness, viewing negatively Africa, and by extension, spreading that in the culture, spreading that in the education, and this basically having disastrous consequences upon Black lives. I'm sorry it was a little bit long. I tried to do as short as I could.
No problem. No problem. Very important topic, and anywhere we get the opportunity to get to share about anti-Black racism, we need to talk about it, and we need to get a historical perspective on it. So we will move on to another
Sorry, Dr. Val, if I can just add, when you said very important, I want to stress that upon my Black people. We live in a world where on the four corners of the world, Black people are victims of racism. When I say Black people are victims of racism, yes, white supremacy is global, but white supremacy is more present in the Western world. And yet, it is in the Western world that Blacks have more rights in terms of the dignity of life than in the four corners of the world. In North Africa and the Middle East, as in Tunisia, Black people are buried separately from white Tunisians. In the Middle East, you have the kafala system, where basically those who are darker skinned, so including Bangladeshis and Filipinos, are treated basically as what is called modern day slavery. You have Aryan supremacy, where basically in India, those who are white, the white Indians, the Aryans, they're the ones who really were created today's caste systems that is also a matter of race. The original caste system of the Hindus people, the Dravidian, was not based on skin color. This came 4,000 years ago when white, called Aryans, from Turkey, Iran, started to invade. And you also get Han supremacy, just as Nippon supremacy. So there are all types of supremacy. It's not just white supremacy. Don't fool yourself and those other people, because this is something notably that happens in North Africa and the Middle East. They always point the finger to white people. They're like, we're not racist. It's white people who are racist. That's not true at all. That's not true at all. And if I were to tell you the truth, racism came to white as the last ones. They were not the first ones. We just feel it today because of the last 500 years. But you go to, for example, India, we're talking about 4,000 years. So it's just important for my Black people to understand this and that. It's not just systemic racism and white supremacy just because it's white people, but then all the other groups, aka people of color, a racist term, we tend to think it's individuals. It's not. They also have the institutions of racism that are there, that are solidly in the society, whether it be through religion, whether it be through culture, whether it be through education and the political regime, such as the case of Peking men.
Okay, no problem. We're going to move forward and talk about, well, two events. First of all, we're going to talk about Juneteenth, which I don't hear talked a lot about in Canada. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? L. Jones?
Well,
What
it
do you
isn't.
think?
So Juneteenth is the day that enslaved people in Texas were liberated. It's the final liberation after slavery. So it is not a Canadian celebration. Our celebration is Emancipation Day, shared by the people who are part of the British Empire around the world on August 1st. In recent years, people have been marking Juneteenth in Canada because, you know, we're very influenced by the States, right? I mean, like what we see in the US makes its way here. But I mean, the proper thing was for us to join Emancipation Day, which Canada only recently joined. As like last year was our first official Emancipation Day. My grandfather was part of the first Emancipation Day celebrations. Well, the first Emancipation Day celebrations were like when people were actually emancipated. But then,
Right.
you know, when they began celebrating it in Trinidad, my grandfather was in that committee. So we're very late joining Canada in terms of the countries that have formerly enslaved colonies of England. And that, of course, has a lot to do with Canada's denial of histories of enslavement. So Trinidad has been celebrating this. The Caribbean has been celebrating Emancipation Day. There's been celebrations in the UK. Like, we were the only ones not celebrating Emancipation Day until last year. So Juneteenth, yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to say on the topic of if we should do it in Canada or not. I tend to think that we're probably too influenced by the United States, but it I think is the first year they're having it as a national holiday in the States. Like, they're actually getting the day off tomorrow. So I think this is
so.
so I think this is their first national holiday for Juneteenth. But partly it's a reminder of a few things. One is that, you know, despite what we sort of think, that obviously liberation came in pieces and continues to come in pieces. So not everybody was free at the same time. And that is true globally as well. Like, Brazil was the last country to end enslavement in the 1880s. So
1888,
yeah, so, you know, like, and they of course had the most slaves on the country, and we don't know that as well. The most people in the world, most enslaved people went to Brazil, right?
Wow.
The most enslaved people were not under cotton slavery in the States. We just get a vision of that because we live by the States. It was rice and sugar cane slavery in the Caribbean. Cane slavery is the main one. So a lot of our understanding of slavery in Canada is very much conditioned by what's happening in the US. And we, don't have a good understanding of enslavement in Canada still, and B, don't have a good understanding of the movement of African people around the globe because of enslavement. So it's like when you watch the World Cup in soccer and all of a sudden you're like, well, there's all these like black people in Uruguay, like there's black people in Costa Rica. Like, you know, all the teams are always black because people need us as athletes. And that's what you see, like all these countries that obviously had enslaved communities that, you know, pretty much only show up at the World Cup, and otherwise we don't see them in the tourism ads. We don't see them represented as part of the culture of these countries. So I think it's important that we understand our place in global enslavement, and B, our own specific history. But then also we can learn from this history, the ways that, you know, the incremental movement of slavery, that everybody did not reach. And it's like when they heard they were no longer, you know, which is an interesting moment, because it's like when they realized they're no longer enslaved too, right? Like, it's like the message has to get there. So I think the message of any Liberation Day, globally in the US or in Canada, should always be for us to contemplate, you know, how we got here and how much further we have to go. I think the contemplation of history should always be about recognizing how it impacts us in the present, and, you know, what can we learn about liberation struggles, and then how do we apply those liberation struggles today. So, you know, the fact that we're talking about Juneteenth days after this police apology. So, you know, Black people are not free in Canada, right? Like, we are provisionally free, but we know we don't have full and complete freedom. Freedom, the beloved slogan of the right wing now, especially, you know, like the Freedom Convoy. You know, so they've taken on this notion of freedom. And if you've been watching anything to do with the January 6th hearings, it's very clear that, you know, white right-wingers believe that they and only they determine democracy. So everybody else's vote is de facto false and fake vote, right? And when you watch them storming the Capitol and like talking to the police and being like, we're right, we're the people, you work for us, like they believe that they are the true Americans, and that therefore for them to undertake this violent act is not a violent act, it's a righteous act, because democracy belongs solely and only to them. And it doesn't belong to anybody else, including us. And then you see that same rhetoric brought into the Freedom Convoy in Canada. So this notion for white people, like white conservative, white supremacists, right ringers, is always this idea that we are fundamentally meant to be unfree. And that's why they don't care when we're getting racially profiled. They're not freedom convoying when like carding happens, but they're freedom convoying when, you know, they're told they can't come into a restaurant without a mask, right? Like then they're like, oh my God, my freedom. And it just reminds you that, yeah, they've always believed that freedom is a solely white heritage, and specifically a white conservative heritage, because they see those other white people as like race traitors, essentially, like liberal whites or Biden or whoever it is. That's why they'll talk about the woke and the virus of woke, and wokeism has infected people. And that's just really contamination theory. That is an old racial theory that contacted Black people leads to, it's a racial hygiene theory, that we quite literally contaminate those around us, either through our blood, like through miscegenation, through having sex with us, or through our quite literal dirt, like as Cesar was talking about, this idea of I'm a dirty African. Fanon has talked about this, the native quarter always seen as a dirty place. Or if it's through like a conceptual dirt, like we play our Black music in public and that contaminates white suburban kids. We act Black in public and we're loud and that contaminates people. So we're always like shedding our Blackness and contaminating people. And therefore we are not part of like the public or of this like polity or citizenship. And we are never imagined to have a legitimate voice. So when we're talking about freedom in this moment, I'll stop. I know this is a long discourse, but we also need to understand the way that the white right has really taken this on, not as part of a global liberation struggle, not as the struggle towards housing or being free of police, or the struggle to be, have childcare or, to live in a safe community, but part of this authoritarian right-wing push to say that white people are the proper inheritors of Canada, North America, the USA. They're the only proper citizens, the only proper members of the public, and their freedom is to be unconstrained by anything. So your free speech means you can make whatever racist jokes. Your freedom means that, and nobody can tell you what to do as an individual white person. You are completely free to oppress others, because that is not oppression, it's righteousness. So yeah, I think it's important to reflect today the difference between like that kind of freedom and true liberation. And I'll stop talking. Cesar, it is your turn.
That was beautiful, El. Thank you. Thank you for that share. Cesar, what would you like to add on?
I agree with so many things that El Jones said that, I had to applaud, because she's correct. She's correct. Allow me to maybe add a few pointers, starting with absolutely the proximity to America, and America being the empire of the world, and us being so awash of American cultural content, makes it that Juneteenth basically gets talked about here. But, how often do Americans celebrate anything Canadian? Even their attempt to have I forget how they named it, the American version of the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah.
That was a dismal failure. But in my part, I give salutations to a family in the United States. I have family in the United States, but especially my wife, who is African American, has family there. And as such, last year was really the first time that I celebrated Juneteenth, because, of course, our child is half Sawa from Cameroon and half African American. And for me, it's absolutely important to celebrate all her identities, all her Black identities. Another thing that I will add, in which Elgers was absolutely correct, is, and of course, this does not take anything away from Juneteenth, of course, but in Canada, Emancipation Day, August 1st, Great Britain basically outlawing slavery per se. But another very important point, when you watch those football teams, and you see the Black representation on those teams, that's when for many people, they realize that, wait, there are Black people there, etc., etc. Except in Argentina. The Argentinian team doesn't have Black people. It's important for Black people to understand why. It's important for Black people to understand that from Canada to Brazil, so from north to south of the Americas, including the Caribbean, only Argentina does not have Black players. Now, surprise, surprise, many Black people think there are no Black people in Argentina. There are Black people in Argentina. There are survivors. Argentina and Brazil had the two worst forms of slavery. In Argentina, they borderline wiped out the Black population. If not, they sent them to Brazil. The very few Black Argentinians who are there are survivors, the Afro-Argentinians. And Brazil had the worst slavery. They had the earliest slavery, and they had the slavery that lasted the longest, 1888, and they had the slavery that killed the most. 10 times more Africans were kidnapped and enslaved in Brazil than in the United States. Today, there is 2 to 2.5 times more Black people. That's how much they kill, from 10 times more to 2.5. Last but not least, as a Pan-Africanist, I recognize and celebrate all our Black holidays, of course. You know, in all fairness, as we recognize Juneteenth for our African American sisters and brothers, as we must teach our Canadian children, youth, and families about Emancipation Day, August 1st, we must also know about November 20th. November 20th, which is celebrated by the largest Black population outside of Africa, in Brazil, Zumbi Day. Zumbi, the national hero of Afro-Brazilians. So let's celebrate Juneteenth on June 19th. Let's celebrate Emancipation Day on August 1st. Let's celebrate January 1st for our Haitian sisters and brothers. And let's also celebrate November 20th, Zumbi Day, for our Afro-Brazilians, sisters and brothers who have suffered the worst slavery and still suffered the worst type of systemic racism in all of the Americas.
Good stuff. And also on this day, we're broadcasting live on June 19th. It is Father's Day. So this will be our last conversation topic for the day. And I want Elle to start with this. And I know, Elle, you're very passionate and you're very involved helping Black male inmates. And you have seen the impact of the prison or the criminal justice system on Black fathers.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say about Black fatherhood is that there's so much misinformation about it. So, you know, I mean, I saw a lot of cracks from racists online about, oh, it must be confusing. It's Juneteenth and Father's Day. Like, you know, how are Black people going to handle that? They don't have dads. Black dads are actually some of the most involved dads. Black men change more diapers. Black men do more hands-on parenting. So I think to a certain extent, we should dead the myth of like the deadbeat Black dad. Black men are very involved in their children's lives and do many more tasks than men of other races, actually, when you actually look at studies. So that's the first piece. The second piece is, yes, you know, many of our Black fathers are prevented by the state from parenting their children as they would wish because they are incarcerated. I know many Black men who are incarcerated who do their best to act as parents. Some of these are in immigration detention or so I know men that are in Canada that came on migrant worker programs so that they could care for their children, like voluntarily left their homes and families so that they could come here to work on farms and then end up in some kind of detention and, you know, are still doing their best to parent their children. Of course, parental rights in general in prison are harsh, but particularly like there's not a lot of access. But, you know, at least with women, there's some kind of advocacy for women to see their children. There's very little advocacy for men, and particularly Black men in prison, to have access to their children. It's pretty much left up to your partner. If they're willing to bring the child or at least to keep contact or whatever, then it happens. But there's no real like demand. And of course, if a Black man tried to go to court for parental rights and he's in prison, there's no way he's getting them, right? So for a lot of people, it's challenging as they try to parent children from prison. And many people very much they want to have their family visits. And the system just does not support it very well, particularly for everybody in prison, but particularly for men. I think that we know that the state has long separated Black families, created a lot of the divide and rule myths that exist in the Black community. So let me tell you a bit about the Moynihan Report. So, you know, Black communities have always been matriarchies, and not in the sense of like unequal power, but we know that our, you know, Black women are extremely strong. Our grandmothers are the roots of our communities. I think everyone would concede that, you know, our elder Black women in particular in our families, right, have always held that down. And that goes back into many African cultures, not all of them, but we come from very strong maternal cultures. We come from very strong maternal lines. During enslavement in particular, it was, you know, Black mothers that kept the family going. Black women could escape much less than Black men because of the demands of parenting, right? Like women had children. So there's a great poem by a Trinidadian poet called I Say It Was the Woman, who says, it was the woman who saved us. It was the woman who brought us back to ourselves. We've always had that role. And that was always understood and something that was beautiful in the Black community, that, the hardest thug on the street will be greeting an elder and call her Miss So-and-so and come and, clean her house for her and clean her yard. We've always had that respect, particularly towards our grandmothers in our culture. And like I said, the hardest G will still be out here respecting older Black women because he knows still, he still loves her. Men in prison are very respectful to women in my experience. They know who's holding them down. And under Nixon, there's a guy named Moynihan who basically decided one way to break the Black community was through gender relations. So he makes the Moynihan Report. And the idea is that he really installs a white supremacist kind of capitalist idea and says, the problem in the Black community is the women are too strong and the women are emasculating the men and removing the men from their God-given positions at the head of the household. And of course, if you're experiencing racism and white supremacy, where somebody's calling you boy, where you don't have the ability to feed your family in the way you would like because of how white supremacy is holding you back from jobs, if you have to look at the ground when you walk past people, if in every way white people are taking your manhood from you, when somebody says, here's a way to have your so-called manhood back in your home, that seems seductive. You're being stripped of your masculinity by a white supremacist society. And Moynihan basically comes to exploit that to say, the problem in the Black community is Black women are too strong, and tries to bring in this gender war idea, right? That the problem isn't that Black men are held down through white supremacy, it's these bitchy Black women. And this is adopted through conservative Blacks and through various, and it's sort of forced in our community. And so this rhetoric has stuck around, and it creates this gender stuff in our community where we're like, Black women have attitude, Black men don't do this, so it's, and I want to say that that's an artificial thing that was put into our community through white supremacy. We always, in fact, the most forward-thinking community in terms of, we had feminism before it was named feminism because we had strong Black women, all of us, long before white people were like, this is feminism, women need this and that. That was always in the Black community. We always had strong, outspoken Black women holding us down, running our communities in particular ways, doing organizing, teaching, all of these roles that women had. So I think on Father's Day, we can remember that, this rhetoric around Black men not caring for children, Black men and women can't get along, we got bad attitude, Black men are shiftless. All of this is a construction of white supremacy. And that doesn't mean that we don't have healing to do in our community. We do. But we have to understand that we have healing to do because of these narratives around Black men are deadbeat, Black men don't take care of their kids, Black men like white women more, Black men, Black women and Black men just da-da-da-da-da-da. That's all an artificial invention. And so today we can hold up our brothers, the many Black men holding it down in so many ways. The many good brothers that are out there that are supporting women, the many good brothers that are talking to other brothers and making sure that in our community we're talking about the things that we need to change and heal. Black men that are both on the front lines themselves and supporting women in the work that we do. We have so many examples of that, and we can't be swayed by a media landscape that so often wants to, represent Black men as useless, Black men as not family people, when in fact we are, Black families as not intact, when in fact they are, Black parenting as not real parenting, when in fact Black parents are very hands-on and, very loving and very in their children's lives, and this is this myth you get at schools, for example, where Black parents are simultaneously seen as not parenting their kids, but also too interfering, right? So no matter what we do, we're labeled in these particular ways that make us think that we're not doing our jobs, that we're not parenting, that we're not doing all these things, and we are. So shout out to the many, many Black men holding their families down, holding their communities down. And let's not let white supremacy get in our heads and continue to try and destroy our relationships with our families, with our generations to each other, and particularly between women and men. So that's it, I guess.
Wonderful. Cesar, you'll close us out with Father's Day message.
Very powerful as usual. I am absolutely in full agreement. We have, as Black fathers, but as well as Black men, because fathers, stepfathers, grandfathers, uncles and cousins, we have, I'm not saying just to do better, but we have to do better by ourselves as individuals, by ourselves in terms of I give a very concrete example. Too often I walk the street and we see brothers mean mugging one another. Why you mean mugging the other Black man? We should look at each other as a brother to a brother. We should look at each other as a brother to a brother. And as such, we also have to do better by ourselves as a community, starting in our homes with our women, with our mothers, our sisters, our partners, our children. And of course, seeing ourselves as a community, seeing ourselves as, to be honest, when I look at the screen, I see another black man. We talk about George Floyd. He's the tree that hides the forest of so many black men, but as well women and children. When I see and I hear Sister L. Jones, wow, it sounds like so many of our queens who stood up for the cause, without fear, even despite knowing the consequences. As such, when we say Happy Father's Day, it's really the passing of the baton to stand up, to be the leaders, kind of in the frame behind me, to inspire each other to stand up for our people and, to stay away from the negativity that comes in terms of white supremacy, Arab supremacy, Arab Muslim supremacy, all those other supremacies that are named, but as well from within our community, those will benefit from dividing us, those who are community pimp, those who are basically, excuse my language, I say this very much as a joke, but I think some people will get it, the Dick Cannon Gang, aka having multiple children by multiple women. These are the consequences of broken homes that create broken individuals, broken choices, and broken family. We have to stay away from all these toxic elements of division and sabotage within our community, just as to push back on those other elements that come from non-Black people. Let us shoulder one another. Let us support one another. We can do this for our ancestors and for the generations to come.
Wonderfully said. And before we close out there, was a question for Elle that she can address now. Jerry is asking, can you ask Elle her thoughts on the conservative leadership race and what it means for Black people?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have Leslyn Lewis running again. And the thing about Leslyn Lewis is she's trying to outflank Pierre Poilievre, the clear frontrunner from the right. So one of the interesting things is actually accurately, she's like, you weren't down for the convoy. I was. Like, you weren't on this COVID stuff. I was. Which is like both dangerous and interesting, right? Because she's really trying to take up this populist space, but as a Black woman within the Conservative Party. Now, I have zero support for any of this. Obviously, there are conservative Black people. That's fine if you're a traditional conservative. It's not my mindset, but many types make a world. But obviously, the kind of ways that conservatism / republicanism through Trumpism is moving is extremely frightening for Black people. There's a difference between a traditional Black conservative who, just believes in fiscal responsibility and, I'm not a conservative, but there's many reasonable conservatives through history. Like, it's not an irrational viewpoint. It's not mine, but there are reasonable conservatives. It doesn't have to be a white supremacist. You can be conservative and not be all of those things. But of course, the modern conservative movement is very, very tied up in the culture war. And the culture war is directed towards women, gay people, Black people. The so-called idea of wokeism is how they put it now. Everything's always the woke, which is a phrase lifted from Black people in the first place. It's a phrase of Black consciousness. So it shows exactly how racist it is when you take a term meant to describe Black consciousness and now you use it to describe everything wrong with the world. Oh, the woke, So I think there's Leslyn Lewis, but then what's really worrying about the conservative race in general is, of course, Poilievre, who, as many right-wing populists through history has done, is seized upon real social issues. And rather than people turning towards mass social democratic programs and advocating for things like more unions, more pensions, more housing, affordable housing, affordable post-secondary education or free post-secondary education, it turns into anti-immigrant, anti-Black, this kind of populist rhetoric. And we're very much in this moment right now. Trump effectively used it. Poilievre is very effectively using it. And there's a real crisis right now, an inflation crisis. Gas is out of reach. People can't put food on their table, quite literally. The cost of living, there's no housing. So people are in a real crisis. And then the danger is, of course, that populist politicians come through, and as Poilievre is doing, and they really gather a following based on this false rhetoric that on the surface seems like it's speaking to the people, but is actually speaking to white people, that excludes the rest of us out of this. Is the same stuff as freedom. And then, of course, very dangerously, as we saw with Trump, unleashes all these extremely violent forces. We are not immune from that in Canada. We're seeing that happening. Traditionally, there's an idea that there was a kind of social pact between the Liberals and Conservatives, and not much would ever change when the Conservatives came to power versus the Liberals. That was always the idea in Canada, that, there's slight differences, but center right and center left, or center, like it's kind of like center right and then center for the Liberals and then center left for the NDP. Like there wasn't much difference between any of it. So you could safely vote for both. And we usually just go between Conservatives and Liberals. But that is changing. We have people talking about abortion. We have people talking about these very radical, like anti-immigrant border politics. We have people talking about law and order in particularly dangerous ways. And then all wrapped up in this culture war that is about stoking resentment, right? So that woke person over there wants to take your child from you and make them gay or trans. Like that woke person is trying to make you hate yourself as a white person by teaching you critical race theory. That woke person just has a job through affirmative action. So you as a white man can't get a job anymore because that woke person's in your job through EDI, right? This is the kind of rhetoric, and it's extremely dangerous rhetoric. And Black people need to be, I think, very aware, because we've looked at it from afar in the States, and it's very much part of what we're seeing in the Conservative Party now. If you watch any of the debates, they're not talking about policy. That's literally, I supported the convoy more than you supported the convoy. I was against COVID stuff before you were against COVID stuff. I'm going to say something racist about Indigenous people. I'm like, we're going to return freedom to like white people. That's basically what's happening in these debates. So Les and Lewis is kind of embarrassing. But also, I think we need to be very concerned about what's happening in the modern conservative movement, and we have to be pushing back against it. There's a ton of conspiracy theory. A study just came out that showed like huge percentages of people believe in this contemporary conspiracy theory stuff, like, which has a grain of truth, right? Like this is always taken from a place, and this is why it's frightening. If it were just completely unhinged, that would be one thing. But it is true that the pharma industry, for example, we saw this in the opiate crisis. We know that the pharma industry, has sold us drugs illegitimately. We know they block, Medicare for all in the States. But then that turns into there's a tracking chip in the vaccine, right? We know that corporations very much have a ton of political power and that billionaires actually do run this world. But that does not mean that, there is a Jewish elite, in a back room, plotting against our lives, right? Which is a very old conspiracy theory. So they take something that is true. Corporations have immense power. There's a 1% elite that does not pay their taxes and has immense political power. And then it turns into conspiracy theory that is then used to sort of suggest that, we as the brown people are tools of this elite class that's using race and division to destroy the white working class or something. And it's very worrying. There's a lot of that circulating, and we as Black people have to be aware of it. We have to be organizing against it. We have to be pushing back, because some of our own people sort of buy into some of this stuff, not understanding that it's white supremacist and that it's, part of these older conspiracy theories that have always been circulating. And yeah, that's, I guess, my thoughts. Sorry, they weren't super coherent, but Cesar, go ahead.
Sorry, do you want to add anything before we close out?
Brilliantly said. From the very start, Al said something that Dr. Vibe, I've told you time and again. I do not understand what a Black woman is doing running for leadership of a very white party as a conservative party. That to me should speak volume. And at the end, Al said it's right. So many Black people are buying into this, and yet ultimately they are seen as the others. They are seen as part of the problem. They are seen as, whether it's Make America Great Again or Make Canada Great Again, that image doesn't include Black people. That is a white supremacist image. And there was even an article, I can't remember from where, but a former conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, talking about trying to find a middle ground in terms of conservatism, in terms of a center, but because populism is so strong. At the end of the day, look, I don't have much to say. Al said it very well, but, liberal or conservative, sure, we can talk about them as white parties in a white nation. But I know one thing, The Conservative Party does not recognize systemic racism. That right there is a red flag that basically says it all for me. Like, you don't recognize the particular discrimination of the group of people I belong to. Why would I support you?
And also refused to put in a bill against Islamophobia because they said it hurt their free speech, right?
Like, it's like they literally tell you themselves. I mean, even if we look at what was it, the last federal elections, I think 2021. How many black candidates were there for the Conservative Party? In 2018, how many black candidates? So this is not to say that because you're black, you can't be conservative. That's not true. Even when we look at the US, there are black Republicans, there are Latino Republicans as well. But there is a difference in terms of saying that you're conservative, and there's a difference to say that you're a black conservative or supports whether it's Donald Trump or and also we have to stop saying the Freedom Convoy. It's not the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah.
We're talking about freedom. It's the white privilege convoy of Canada. That's what it is. The white privilege convoy of Canada. So these white fragiles have basically infected the mind of so many black people who are desperate for integration, acceptation by whites. That's what it is. That's what it is. I mean, we have black people who are dying of freedom, because of police brutality, because of, imperialism and neocolonialism. And you have people who go occupy downtown Ottawa for 3 weeks over wearing a mask in a pandemic. It's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
All right.
Allow me to leave it there. Thank you,
I shall
Dr.
do
Al.
that.
Al
I
Jones
shall
said
do
it
that.
well.
All right. Well, another epic conversation. Black Canada Talking every Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. As always, I'd like to thank both Elle and Cesar for taking time out of their positive, productive schedules. And before we close out, Miss Elle, how can people get a hold of you?
You can always find me at the Mount. You can send me an email. I don't know. Not really anywhere else. I try and keep a low profile when it comes to that stuff.
Okay, no problem. Your email address?
el.jones@msvu.ca. It's available online. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be giving it out because some creeps be calling my work and stuff.
Could imagine. Cesar, how can people get a hold of you?
Please get a hold of me on Facebook, Cesar Remy, R-I-M-Y. I'm still there.
Okay, no problem. And for myself, you can get a hold of me. These are the best ways. Website, the Dr. Vibe Show up on the screen, or if you're listening on replay, THEDRVIBESHOW.com. Email dr@the drvibeshow.com. Excuse me. Facebook, The Dr. Vibe Show. Twitter, Dr. Vibe Show. And Instagram, The Dr. Vibe Show. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who watched us live or watch us on replay or listen to us via replay. And you can watch replays of this epic conversation on my website, or you can watch on YouTube and Facebook. Just put in the Dr. Vibe Show and subscribe. Please subscribe. Would appreciate that. And it's not taken for granted. So before we close out, we're going to do this. Live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get small to get stronger. Block assumptions, then aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. Love, faith, and respect. Remember to give yourselves grace. Don't just manage your time, manage your energy. I'm going to end off with 3 quick messages for fathers. First of all, fathers are at their best when they are present. Second of all, fathers are at their best when they speak words of affirmation. And then finally, fathers are at their best when they lead with grace. God bless. Peace to all. Keep the faith. While good. See you next week.